In the deepest hours of the night, when the country is quiet enough for its ghosts to whisper, there's a story America hoped would never find its way back into the light. It begins with a map, one you've never seen, because the town at its center was erased before most Americans were even born. Not abandoned, not forgotten, erased, and the people who came from it, they carried the silence like a hereditary curse. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. An entire community breathing beneath the soil, waiting for someone reckless enough to dig them up. They called it Briar Hollow, though the name rarely passed beyond county lines. You won't find it in the official archives, and if you ask locals, they'll deny knowing anything about it. But the truth is simpler and darker. Briar Hollow wasn't just isolated. It was quarantined from the American story, a town stitched together by a handful of families, left to rot behind a wall of indifference. No real roads in, no real roads out. Children born there came into a world already considered a mistake. Adults died knowing the world outside never once asked their names. The first record I ever found was a death certificate, unfiled, unsigned, but real. A woman in her 40s, cause of death listed as unresolved complications due to locality. Locality, as if the place itself had poisoned her. As if Briar Hollow wasn't just remote but hostile. It raised a question that kept me awake for months. What kind of town kills by existing? The more I dug, the more the past resisted. Pages missing, microfilm scratched. Newspaper clippings cut out with surgical precision. Someone had tried to smother the story long before I ever came across it. But erasure leaves fingerprints. Every silence is a shape. And the shape around Briar Hollow was unmistakable, a void, carved with intention. People who lived near the border spoke of strange lights at night, of voices echoing through the trees long after the town had supposedly died. One man swore he saw figures wandering the old road, barefoot, faces hidden, searching for something they'd lost decades ago. He told me he never forgot the sound they made, not crying, not speaking, just existing, like they didn't know how to stop. And maybe that's the real reason America pretended Briar Hollow didn't exist. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was a mirror, one we weren't ready to look into. Some say Briar Hollow was born wrong, that from the very beginning, it was a place stitched together out of necessity, not hope. Tucked between two ridges that blocked the sun for half the year, the town sat in a permanent half-light, as if the sky itself refused to acknowledge it. Families who settled there weren't pioneers or dream chasers. They were the unsortable pieces of America's past. The displaced, the unwanted, the ones pushed out of growing towns by whispers no one dared write down. They didn't choose Briar Hollow. They ended up there because every other place had already decided they didn't belong. What made the town so unusual wasn't just its physical isolation. It was the way people vanished from its story. Census takers skipped the region completely for 3 consecutive decades. Mail routes curved around it like a wound best left alone. Even state surveyors marked the land as unspecified terrain, a label usually reserved for swamps or uninhabitable mountains. But Briar Hollow wasn't uninhabitable, it was simply disqualified. The families inside understood in a quiet, crushing way that they were cut off. I found a journal entry from a resident named Lucinda Hargrove, dated 1923. Her handwriting trembled, as if she was scared the page might scream if she pressed too hard. The children ask what lies beyond the ridge. We tell them stories. But deep down they know no one waits for us there. We are a loose thread America plans to snip. Imagine living with that knowledge, that you were born into a place already marked for deletion, that the world outside had silently agreed your existence was an error. Over time, that isolation reshaped the people. Families grew inward, traditions hollowed into rituals, and the town developed a rhythm that felt less like a community and more like a sealed ecosystem. Outsiders who did stumble in by accident described the same unsettling sensation, a feeling that every person they passed had been staring at the same wall their entire life, waiting for it to move, waiting for someone to tell them they existed. And the children, they grew up with a different kind of hunger, not for food, but for recognition. For proof that they were part of a world larger than the valley that held them prisoner. Some tried to leave. Some succeeded. But those who escaped carried Briar Hollow like a scar they couldn't explain. They rarely spoke of it. And when they did, their voices cracked as if the truth was too heavy to pull into daylight. That's when I realized something crucial. A town doesn't disappear on its own. It has to be disappeared. The first sign that Briar Hollow wasn't just forgotten, but deliberately hidden, came from an interview with a man who refused to give his name. He lived 2 counties over, in a house that smelled of cedar and old tobacco, the kind of place where secrets settle into the wood. When I mentioned the town, his face drained of all warmth. He didn't ask how I'd heard of it. He asked why I hadn't let it stay buried. He told me that back in the 1930s, state officials attempted what they called an evaluation survey. A polite phrase that usually meant they were looking for something valuable beneath the soil. Briar Hollow didn't have coal seams or timber worth fighting over, but it had something far more inconvenient, a population the government didn't know how to categorize. Families without birth certificates, marriages without records, children with no proof of parentage, an entire community that existed beyond the paperwork that made America feel in control of itself. The inspectors stayed one night. They never returned. The man wouldn't tell me exactly what happened, only that the officials left before dawn, white as bone, refusing to speak to each other. By the time they reached the county courthouse, they'd agreed on a single line, no further action required. And just like that, Briar Hollow became a place frozen in the margins, too strange to help, too human to harm, too inconvenient to acknowledge. But the strangest part wasn't the silence from the state. It was the silence from the people inside the valley. According to old letters found in an estate sale, families stopped sending correspondence altogether around 1934, not gradually, abruptly, as if someone or something convinced them that reaching outward was pointless. There's a letter from a mother to her sister in Louisville, the final one she ever sent. "If we leave," she wrote, "we lose the little we still are. If we stay, we lose everything else. Tell the children we love them. Don't come for us." What kind of place makes a woman believe rescue is worse than staying trapped? As I followed these traces, a pattern emerged. People from neighboring towns spoke of briar fences that grew unnaturally thick, blocking the old paths, of strange weather that seemed to hang over the hollow even when the rest of the county was clear. They said it felt like the town had built its own cocoon, not to keep danger out, but to keep its people in. And every story carried the same unspoken terror. Briar Hollow wasn't dying, it was waiting. Something changes in a place when generations grow up believing the outside world has already condemned them. It starts slow, a shift in posture, a silence that lingers too long, a kind of inherited resignation. But in Briar Hollow, the change was sharper, almost unnatural, as if the valley itself shaped the minds of those who lived within it. Every record I found, every survivor I spoke to, hinted at the same transformation. The people began turning inward, not just socially but psychologically. They stopped asking questions. They stopped arguing. They stopped dreaming. A former resident named Caleb Porter, one of the few who escaped before the collapse, told me something that still claws at the back of my mind. He said that in his final years there, the nights became the worst part. Not because of the darkness, but because of what his neighbors did during it. When the sun dipped behind the ridge, the town didn't grow quiet. It grew expectant. Families gathered in their homes without speaking. Lamps stayed unlit. Windows remained open, even in winter. It felt, he whispered, like we were all waiting for something to arrive, or return. He remembered sounds drifting through the hollow, not screams, not footsteps, but a low murmuring, like dozens of voices praying in a language he didn't understand. When he pressed his parents about it, they acted like he'd mentioned the weather, ordinary, unremarkable routine. "That's when I realized," he said, "that whatever held that town together wasn't tradition. It was obedience." I found supporting hints in church records, sparse, frantic entries from a pastor who seemed more frightened of his congregation than responsible for them. One line struck me: "They've stopped listening to the sermons. They watch me, but they're listening to something else." Another entry months later: "I have lost the room." A final one, scratched into the margin with shaking hand: "The hollow speaks." Was it metaphor, madness, or something else entirely, something shaped by years of isolation, deprivation, and abandonment? Even the children weren't immune. Report cards showed steady decline in academic performance, paired with increasingly uniform handwriting, as if each child's individuality was being worn away. Teachers noted that students hesitated before answering questions, glancing toward the windows as though awaiting permission from an unseen presence beyond the glass. One teacher fled mid-semester, her final note ready: "They only smile when they shouldn't." By the early 1940s, the transformation was complete. Briar Hollow was no longer a town. It was a closed system, a sealed chamber, a living memory loop trapped in human form. And yet, beneath all that strangeness, another truth began to emerge, something no one outside the town ever suspected. They weren't just isolated, they were preparing. Preparation implies intention. But when I reached this part of the story, the part most people tried to burn, bury, or forget, I realized Briar Hollow's intentions weren't simple. They weren't sinister in the way legends like to imagine. They were something far more disturbing. They believed they were protecting themselves from us. From the world that cast them out, from the judgment that always seemed to follow their bloodlines like a curse. By 1947, the town had developed rituals, Not religious, not cultural, but psychological. They gathered in the old meeting hall once a month. No light, no music, no written agenda. Survivors described it as an alignment, a kind of collective recalibration where the town reaffirmed its separation from the outside world. One woman who attended as a girl said the gatherings felt like standing inside a heartbeat, slow, heavy, rhythmic, each person breathing in unison until she could no longer distinguish her own breath from those around her. And in those moments, she said something settled over them, a stillness so complete it felt like surrender. The people of Briar Hollow weren't preparing for invasion, rebellion, or salvation. They were preparing for disappearance, a chosen vanishing, a collective decision that if the world didn't want them, then they would make themselves unreachable, not by walls or weapons, but by becoming something the outside world would never recognize as human enough to understand. That decision started with the children. Around this time, school attendance logs changed. Roll call was replaced with a single mark present. No names, no ages, no distinctions. A perfect homogenization, as if the town believed that individuality was the root of their suffering, and removing it was the key to survival. Adults followed. Birthdays stopped being celebrated. Family surnames faded from use. Even marriages lost their meaning, replaced with a communal pledge not to each other, but to the hollow itself. A pact of permanence. But the strangest part came last. They stopped burying their dead, not because of any belief in resurrection, nothing so comforting, but because graves were seen as attachments to a world beyond the valley. Bodies were left deep in the woods, exposed to time and weather, absorbed back into the land that had held them captive for generations. One survivor told me that, as a child, she asked her mother what would happen if she died. Her mother held her close and said, "You won't leave. None of us leave." I've read accounts of isolated towns before. I've studied cults, lost settlements, abandoned frontier communities. But Briar Hollow was different. They didn't follow a leader. They didn't worship an idol. They didn't fear a monster. They only feared the outside world. And in that fear, they created something wholly unique, a community with no future by design. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? By the early 1950s, the outside world began to notice something was wrong, not because Briar Hollow reached outward, but because the land around it began to change. Hunters reported finding abandoned tools rusting in perfect circles, as if placed deliberately. Hikers who wandered too close returned with stories of paths that led nowhere, trails that looped back on themselves, forest clearings that felt staged, like someone had arranged the trees with human intention. One man claimed he found a line of children standing at the tree line at dawn, silent, barefoot, staring at him with expressions he couldn't name. Not anger, not curiosity, something colder, something that made him leave without turning his back. When he told the sheriff, he was advised, very firmly, to forget what he saw. That was when the government finally stepped back in. But this time, they didn't send inspectors. They sent survey crews with no badges, no marked trucks, no public documentation. People nearby called them the Gray Men, not for their clothing, but for their demeanor. They moved without urgency, without expression, as though they already knew what they would find. What happened during that survey was never officially recorded, but one detail survived through rumor. The crews refused to enter the town at night. They waited for the sun to reach its highest point before stepping past the old boundary stone, and even then, they never stayed longer than an hour. Locals said they could hear strange echoes drifting from the valley during those inspections, like an entire crowd whispering in chorus, though no one could see movement among the buildings. And then, on a cold day in late October, everything stopped. No smoke from chimneys, no sound, no figures. The valley went still. When the crews returned at dawn the next morning, they found the town intact, houses furnished, beds made, meals left half finished. But every resident was gone, not fled, not relocated, gone, clothing left folded at the foot of beds, doors left unlocked, dogs tied to posts whining in confusion, livestock wandering freely. The only thing left behind was a message carved into the meeting hall wall. 8 words, jagged and desperate. "We stayed because no one came for us." The valley was evacuated, sealed, and eventually paved over with state property signs and cheap fencing meant to discourage curiosity. On paper, the town was declared uninhabited due to geological instability. Privately, officials agreed never to mention it again. But here's the part no one prepared for. Over the next decade, descendants of Briar Hollow, those who escaped long before the disappearance, began to vanish from public records too. Not physically, bureaucratically. Birth certificates missing, social security filings deleted, entire family lines dissolving from the official story, as if the country was slowly erasing every last trace of the Hollow's existence. It wasn't until I visited the valley myself that I understood why. The town hadn't been abandoned. It had been absorbed. When I stepped into the valley, decades after it had been sealed, the air felt wrong. Too still, too heavy, as if the place had been holding its breath since the last resident vanished. The trees at the boundary leaned inward, their trunks twisted toward the hollow like they'd spent years growing in a single direction. And beneath my boots, the soil was soft in a way that made my skin crawl, not rotten, not muddy, soft like something recently disturbed. The buildings were skeletal remains of their former selves, yet there was no sign of collapse. No rot, no weather damage. It was as if time passed everywhere except here. The wind didn't move through the town. Sound didn't echo. Even my heartbeat felt quieter, like the valley was trying to muffle it. I found the meeting hall last. Its door hung open, as though someone had stepped inside just moments before. The carving on the wall was still there. Deeper than I imagined, the words gouged into the wood with a force that suggested desperation or warning. But beneath that message, partially hidden under layers of dust, was another line. A second message, carved more lightly, almost as if the writer regretted leaving it at all. We were not meant to be forgotten, only contained. That was the moment the temperature dropped. Not around me, inside me. A cold blooming in my chest that made me realize I was no longer alone in the room. I can't describe what stood behind me because I never turned to look. Something stopped me. Not fear. Instinct. The same instinct that makes animals freeze when the forest goes silent. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a presence. It was recognition. Like the valley itself had turned an eye toward me. Like it knew my name. I forced myself back outside. And as I did, I finally understood what the officials meant when they quietly changed the valley's designation to Restricted Independent Zone. They didn't fear contamination or infection or structural collapse. They feared the town had become sentient, not in a fantastical sense, not a creature rising from the soil, but an ecosystem of abandoned belonging, of generational neglect, of human desperation compacted so tightly that it turned into something self-sustaining, something that didn't need people anymore, only memory, only lineage. And that's why the descendants began disappearing from records, because the valley wants them back. Before I left, I felt the ground tremble, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a distant heartbeat echoing beneath the earth, not threatening, not calling, simply acknowledging. A place America pretended didn't exist had remembered me, and somewhere beneath the soil, Briar Hollow was waiting, patient as ever, for its family to finally come home.